The morning the merchant fleet burned, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a Tuesday in the dry season of 1692, and the harbour of Bridgetown lay gilded under a sky the colour of hammered copper, the kind of sky that sailors, in quieter times, might have called beautiful. 12 vessels rode at anchor in the calm water beyond the coral shelf. Brigs and sloops and 2 heavy-bellied flyboats loaded with Barbadian sugar, indigo, and salted provisions, bound for Bristol and Lisbon. Their captains had breakfasted well that morning. Their manifests were signed, their pilots bribed, their prayers already said. They had no reason to suspect that within 3 hours, 7 of those ships would be burning to the waterline, and the harbour master of Bridgetown would be running barefoot through the cobblestone lanes, screaming a single name into the salt air: Cornelius Vane. The name alone was enough to drain the colour from a merchant's face in those years, from Port Royal to Recife. He was not the most famous pirate of his age. That distinction still belonged to men of greater reputation and fewer scruples, but he was, by the testimony of survivors, the most methodical. He did not raid for spectacle. He did not burn out of rage. He burned, as one of his own crewmen would later confess before a magistrate in Antigua, because he had calculated the precise cost of mercy and found it too expensive. Cornelius Vane was a man who treated slaughter the way a merchant treats spoilage, an unpleasant but necessary reduction of risk. He had not always been this way. Or so the story went. If you are watching from a port town, a coastal city, or anywhere the sea has ever called to you, subscribe now and tell us the name of your city in the comments. You are not alone in these waters. Vane had been born, as best anyone could determine, somewhere along the Cornish coast of England around 1658. The third son of a man who repaired fishing nets and drank himself to sleep every night by the fire. He had gone to sea at 11, cabin boy on a wool trader running between Falmouth and Rotterdam. By 16, he could navigate by stars. By 20, he had crossed the Atlantic twice and developed what his captains privately described as an unsettling talent for anticipating weather changes and enemy intentions in equal measure. He was not physically imposing. Survivors described him as lean and angular, with close-cropped grey hair that had gone silver prematurely, and eyes of a particular shade, pale green, nearly colourless in bright light, that made people uncomfortable in the way that still water makes people uncomfortable. The uncertainty of what lies beneath. He wore no captain's coat when he worked. He favoured a plain dark waistcoat, a knife at the belt, and a single flintlock pistol, tucked at his hip with the casual ease of a man who has never had to reach for it twice. He had earned his first command through mutiny, a clean, bloodless one, or as bloodless as such things ever were, aboard a privateer sloop called the Heron in 1684, when its captain had attempted to sell the crew's shares to a Dutch factor in Curaçao and pocket the difference. The crew had voted. Vane had been elected. The former captain had been put ashore on a sandbar with a flask of water and a philosophical problem: whether the tide came in before or after the sharks arrived. No one had gone back to check. For 8 years after that, Vane had operated in a complicated legal twilight. He had held, at various points, letters of marque from 3 separate colonial governors, English, French, and once, briefly and improbably, Portuguese, each authorizing him to prey upon the enemies of whichever crown was currently paying. In practice, this meant that Cornelius Vane attacked whoever appeared valuable and unlikely to have powerful friends. He was meticulous about paperwork in the way that a man with no fixed loyalty is always meticulous about paperwork. It gave him something to wave at inconvenient moments. By 1690, the paperwork had run out. His last letter of marque, issued by the governor of Jamaica, had been voided following a diplomatic arrangement between London and Madrid that Vane had not been informed of in time to adjust his behaviour accordingly. He had attacked a Spanish silver transport 3 days after the treaty was signed. Not knowing, or perhaps not caring, that the war on paper had already ended, the Spanish filed a formal complaint. The English governor sent a frigate. Vane vanished into the Windward Passage and spent 18 months in a kind of maritime exile, reprovisioning from smaller islands, trading in slaves and stolen goods, gathering around him the particular kind of crew that accumulates around a man when legitimate employment has definitively closed its doors. By the time he appeared off Barbados in the grey pre-dawn of that October morning in 1692, he commanded 2 vessels, his own sloop, the Patience, a name he had chosen with deliberate irony, and a captured Dutch sloop he had renamed the Reckoning. Together they carried perhaps 90 men, a mixed congregation of English deserters, French buccaneers, 2 Africans who had escaped bondage on Saint-Domingue and proven themselves invaluable to the crew, and a Dutchman named Peter Hooft, who served as navigator and who, by all accounts, was the only man aboard Vane regarded with anything approaching respect. The plan had been Hooft's in its broad architecture. The execution was Vane's entirely. Hooft had spent 2 weeks before the raid gathering information from a network of contacts that included a harbour master's clerk in Bridgetown, a chandler who supplied pitch and provisions to the merchant fleet, and a woman who ran a tavern near the waterfront and who had, for reasons she kept to herself, decided that the merchants of Barbados deserved whatever was coming to them. Through these sources, Hooft had learned the departure dates of the fleet, the arrangement of anchor positions, the staffing of the harbour watch at night, and most critically, the fact that 3 of the 12 ships carried payroll silver intended for the colonial garrison in Antigua. It was the silver that had decided Vane. He had listened to Hooft's report in the lamplit cabin of the Patience, the ship riding at anchor behind a small uninhabited quay 15 miles north of Bridgetown, and said nothing for a long time. Through the thin planking of the hull, they could hear the crew playing at cards and singing a low, formless shanty that had no fixed words, only a rhythm that matched the slow roll of the swell. The lantern threw long shadows. Vane had looked at Hooft's hand-drawn chart of the harbour for what felt like a very long time, and then he had said quietly, "We will take the silver ships first. Then we will burn the rest." Hooft had asked, also quietly, whether burning the rest was strictly necessary. Vane had said that it was necessary to prevent pursuit, and also, and this was the part that Hooft remembered and testified to later in the courtroom in Antigua, before his own execution, that it was necessary as a demonstration. Vane believed, with the conviction of a man who has thought carefully about a subject others prefer not to think about at all, that half measures were the most dangerous possible policy. A fleet left burning sent a message. A fleet left intact sent a question. He preferred to deal in messages. They moved on the harbour 3 hours before dawn, when the watch was at its most philosophical and the merchants' crews were at their deepest sleep. The Patience came in low and quiet from the south. Her gun ports closed, her sails minimal, riding the night breeze with the patience her name promised. The Reckoning hung back beyond the coral shelf, positioned to intercept anything that tried to run. The first 3 ships fell without a shot. Vane's men came over the sides in silence, with knives and rope and the particular economy of motion that comes from rehearsal. The crews were bound and placed below. The silver, 3 heavy iron-bound chests on the largest of the flyboats, was transferred to the Patience by a chain of men working in near silence, the only sounds the soft creak of blocks and the occasional splash of an oar. It was on the 4th ship that things changed. The 4th ship was a Barbados-registered brig called the Constant Endeavour, captained by a man named Thomas Welch, a Bristol merchant who had made 7 successful Atlantic crossings and who kept, by habit and perhaps by premonition, a loaded musket under his bunk. He was awake when Vane's men came over the rail. He fired once from the companionway, killed a man named Perrin who had sailed with Vane since the Heron days and shouted for his crew to arm themselves. In the brief and violent space of the next 4 minutes, 3 more of Vane's men were wounded, and Welch himself was shot in the shoulder by Vane, who had come over the rail personally after hearing the first gunshot. Not out of rage, exactly, but out of the same cold calculation that governed all his decisions. He could not allow resistance to become an example for the other ship's crews. He shot Welch cleanly from a distance of perhaps 15 feet with the practiced accuracy of a man who shoots to end situations rather than to make points. Welch did not die immediately. He lived long enough to be brought onto the deck of his own ship, where he sat against the mainmast with his shoulder wrapped in his own coat and watched Vane's men begin the systematic work of plunder. He said several things to Vane during this period that bystanders would later reconstruct from memory with varying degrees of consistency. The version that appeared most often in subsequent accounts had Welch asking Vane whether he considered himself a man or a wolf, and Vane replying, without particular heat, that wolves at least had the honesty not to pretend to be otherwise. Welch died sometime in the following hour. Vane had the body placed back below deck on the Constant Endeavour before the burning. By the time the sun had begun to show colour at the horizon, 7 of the 12 ships were alight. The 5 that Vane had left intact were those whose cargoes had already been transferred or whose positions made them difficult to fire without risk to the Patience herself. This was not mercy, this was geometry. The harbour watch at Bridgetown, a garrison of 14 soldiers supplemented by armed merchant employees, arrived at the waterfront to find the inner harbour a gallery of floating bonfires. The light was extraordinary, orange and red and an intense white at the hearts of the fires where the pitch had caught, and the sound was the combined voice of burning timber, exploding powder stores, and the screaming of seabirds driven from their roosts along the breakwater. The 5 surviving ships had cut their anchor cables and drifted in panic disorder against the far shore. By the time a single gun had been fired from the shore batteries, a shot that fell considerably short of the already retreating sails of the Patience, Cornelius Vane was half a mile offshore and pulling for open water with the tide. The news reached the governor's residence before breakfast. It reached the colonial governor of Barbados, a man named Sir Francis Watson, who had held the position for 3 years and who had, in that time, developed a detailed and visceral understanding of just how little the Royal Navy in the Caribbean could be relied upon to appear when actually needed. Watson was a practical man in most respects, but the scene at the harbour, which he viewed from horseback in his nightgown, surrounded by soldiers who were looking at him for direction, shook him badly enough that he sat on his horse without speaking for nearly 2 full minutes, before his secretary touched his arm and reminded him gently that there were decisions to be made. Watson made them. He dispatched a fast sloop northward to warn Antigua. He sent riders to the 2 small coastal forts on the island's southern shore. He ordered a count of the dead and a full inventory of what had been taken. He wrote, that same afternoon, a letter to the Admiralty in London that began, "I write to inform your lordships of an act of piracy so brazen in its execution and so devastating in its consequence as to represent a clear and present danger to all commerce and settlement in these islands." The letter took 6 weeks to reach London. The response, when it came, recommended patience. In the meantime, Vane was gone. The Patience and the Reckoning passed through the Windward Islands within 2 days of the Bridgetown raid, pausing only to reprovision at a small and sympathetic settlement on the leeward coast of Dominica, whose inhabitants had long since reached an accommodation with men of Vane's profession. Hooft charted a course west-southwest, avoiding the usual shipping lanes, threading through the arc of the Lesser Antilles toward the open Caribbean. The crew was quiet in the days following the raid, not from remorse exactly, but from the particular suppressed tension of men who have done something that cannot be undone and are waiting to discover what the consequences will be. There was, among the crew, a man named Samuel Grieve, who had served as the reckoning's first mate, and who had not, until Barbados, participated in what he thought of as a killing action. He had been a privateer, a smuggler, a man who had done violence when pushed to it. But the planned and systematic nature of Vane's operation at Bridgetown had introduced him to a version of piracy he had not previously encountered up close. He kept his thoughts largely to himself, because keeping thoughts to himself was how one survived aboard the Patience. But Hooft noticed most things, and on the third night out from Dominica, found Grieve sitting alone at the stern, watching the phosphorescent wake dissolve into the darkness behind them. They talked for a long time. Grieve said that he had not expected the burning to bother him. Hooft said that it was possible to be surprised by one's own boundaries. Grieve said that he had seen Perrin's body being wrapped in canvas before they left the Constant Endeavour, and had found himself thinking, without warning, of Perrin's family. A wife somewhere in Bristol, he thought, or perhaps Portsmouth. Hooft said that the sea was full of men whose families did not know exactly what had become of them, and that this was perhaps the oldest and most permanent truth about the ocean. It collected the information of the dead without ever transmitting it. Grieve asked Hooft whether he ever thought about stopping. Hooft looked at the wake for a long moment, then said that stopping was a concept that required a destination and that he had not yet decided where he intended to stop. The question of stopping was not available to Cornelius Vane in quite the same philosophical sense. By the time Watson's reports had circulated through the colonial administration and reached the captains of the 2 Royal Navy vessels nominally assigned to Caribbean patrol, Vane's name had acquired the specific weight that comes from cumulative incident. It appeared on manifests, in depositions, in the sworn testimonies of survivors from Bridgetown and from a Portuguese coastal trader he had taken 3 months earlier near Trinidad, and in a detailed letter from the governor of Curaçao that named him directly in connection with a raid on a Dutch supply convoy the previous spring. He was not yet the most wanted man in the Atlantic, but he was, with the specificity of documented evidence, among the most sought. He knew this. He had known it since Barbados, perhaps before. Hooft had told him, carefully and without drama, that the mathematical probability of continued successful evasion diminished with each significant action, and that the raid at Bridgetown had been significant enough to guarantee serious pursuit. Vane had listened, as he always did, without visible reaction. Then he had said something that Hooft would repeat many times in later years, first to his crew, and then, eventually, to his captors, that the error most pirates made was in believing that safety lay in doing less. In his experience, safety lay in doing things so completely, so decisively, and with such thoroughness, that the cost of pursuing you became higher than the value of catching you. Hooft had pointed out that this logic depended on the other party making rational economic calculations. Vane had agreed that this was a limitation. They made landfall at a small collection of warehouses and fishing huts on the southern coast of Hispaniola in mid-November, 5 weeks after Barbados. The settlement had no formal name that appeared on any colonial map, but the men who used it, buccaneers, smugglers, the occasional French filibuster making repairs, called it Boca Fria, cold mouth, for the way the offshore breeze came down from the mountains at night and chilled the anchored ships. Vane had used it twice before. The people who lived there had no particular loyalty to anyone and were paid in trade goods and left alone, which was an arrangement everyone found satisfactory. It was at Boca Fria that the first serious fracture appeared in Vane's command. The trouble had been building since Barbados, growing in the quiet conversations below decks, in the small silences at mess, in the way certain men looked at Grieve and certain other men looked away. The crew of the Reckoning had been recruited largely by its previous captain, a Portuguese man named Carvalho, who had joined Vane's operation 18 months earlier and whose crew retained a separate sense of identity from the Patience's men. They had shared the work at Barbados, but they had not entirely shared the decision. The burning had been Vane's. The silver was divided equally. The risk was not. Carvalho raised the matter in the direct manner common to men who have decided that silence has become more dangerous than speech. He requested a share renegotiation, citing the unequal exposure of the reckoning during the raid. The flute had been positioned to intercept, but had also been positioned to absorb any naval response that came from the north, a risk that had not been explicitly discussed when the plan was drawn. He presented this argument with the careful neutrality of a man who is making a formal case rather than a personal accusation. Vane heard him out. The crew of both ships was present, assembled on the beach at Boca Fria in the blue dusk, the firelight from the settlement's cooking fires throwing orange across the sand. Hooft stood slightly to Vane's left. Grieve stood with the Reckoning's men. Vane said calmly that the risk distribution had been clear and agreed upon before the raid. He said that the Reckoning's position had been the safer of the two. He said that if Carvalho wished to renegotiate the articles they had signed, he was welcome to take the Reckoning and her crew and their current share and seek employment elsewhere, and that this offer was made without hard feeling. The beach was very quiet for a moment. The surf was gentle. From somewhere in the hills, a bird called once and went silent. Carvalho looked at Vane for a long time. Then he looked at his crew. Then he said that he would accept the current articles and that the matter was closed. It was not, of course, closed, but that night it went back below the surface, where it continued to work. 3 weeks later, in the first week of December, the Royal Navy sloop Vigilance appeared on the horizon, southeast of Boca Fria, on a course that Hooft identified with quiet precision as not coincidental. Someone from somewhere had provided information. Vane did not waste time identifying who. He ordered both ships under sail within 40 minutes of the Vigilance's sighting, running northwest with the trade wind and the advantage of a running start. The chase lasted 2 days. The Vigilance was faster than expected, newly careened, Hooft noted, her bottom clean, and the pursuit was sustained enough to establish without question that whoever had given her their position had done so with enough specificity to be genuinely useful. The Reckoning, carrying the heavier cargo, fell behind on the second afternoon. Vane had a decision to make: reduce the Patience's sail and risk capture to cover the slower ship, or run and leave Carvalho to whatever the Royal Navy intended. He ran. Hooft recorded no comment from Vane during this decision, simply the orders, given in the same flat voice that gave all orders, simply the Patience pulling away through the afternoon sea while the Reckoning fell further behind, her crew visible at distance through Hooft's telescope, crowding her stern to watch the Patience go. The Vigilance took the Reckoning 3 hours before sunset. Carvalho was captured. Grieve was captured. 22 of the flute's crew were taken alive and eventually brought to Antigua, where 11 of them, including Carvalho and Hooft's carefully testifying navigator, were tried before the Vice-Admiralty Court in 1693. 7 were hanged. 4, including Grieve, were transported to penal labor and eventually, in Grieve's case, pardoned during the general amnesty of 1698. Hooft, who had been aboard the Patience, was not among the captured. Neither was Cornelius Vane. They put in at a small harbor on the western coast of Cuba in January 1693, the Patience low on provisions and her crew diminished by 2 men lost in a night squall during the run from the Vigilance. Vane spent 3 days ashore at the Cuban settlement, purchasing supplies from a Spanish trader who asked no questions because the price offered required no questions. On the 4th morning, he went aboard the Patience alone before the crew was awake, sat in the stern cabin with a cup of water and Hooft's charts spread across the table, and spent a long time looking at the Atlantic. He was 44 years old that winter, or close to it. He had been at sea for 33 of those years. He had accumulated in the holds of the Patience and in deposits with a factor in Tortuga whose real name he had never learned. Enough silver and trade goods to retire comfortably somewhere small and forgetful. This was, Hooft would later reflect, the central and unanswerable irony of men like Vane. They had enough, had often had enough for years, and could not stop. Not because the sea held them exactly, but because the life of a man who had stopped being Cornelius Vane was a life that required, first, becoming someone else, and this was a transformation that no amount of silver could purchase. He sailed west in February into the Gulf of Mexico and was not heard from for 8 months. When news of him surfaced again, it came from a Spanish coastal patrol operating out of Veracruz that reported an encounter with an English sloop running without colors that had fired on them and then disappeared into a fog bank north of the Yucatan coast. The description matched the Patience. The incident was reported in a dispatch to the Viceroy of New Spain, who forwarded it to the colonial secretary, who filed it in a leather-bound ledger alongside 100 other reported pirate sightings from that year. The second sighting was more definitive. A Portuguese merchant vessel operating between Cartagena and the Azores reported being overtaken and boarded by the Patience in open Atlantic water south of the Canary Islands in October 1693. The boarding party, the merchant captain stated, was led by a lean man with pale eyes who conducted the entire operation with a thoroughness that suggested long practice. 3 members of the merchant's crew who resisted were confined below. No one was killed. The cargo, spice, dyed cloth, navigational instruments, was taken. The merchant vessel was released. This was noted in subsequent analyses as an anomaly. Vane's Atlantic period, as the colonial administrators eventually called it, lasted through 1694 and into 1695. He operated in a broad arc from the Canary Islands to the west coast of Africa and back again, preying on the slow-moving merchant traffic that crossed those latitudes and avoiding, with Hooft's navigation and his own instinct, any contact with naval vessels. The Patience was re-rigged twice during this period. Her lines altered enough to complicate recognition from a distance. She was renamed briefly, the November, and then a name in Dutch that Hooft suggested and that Vane apparently found acceptable, and then a third name that appeared in only one document and which has since been lost. By 1695, the Admiralty in London had, with the thoroughness that distinguished colonial administration from its actual efficiency, assembled a detailed portrait of Cornelius Vane from surviving accounts, depositions, and the testimonies of the Bridgetown survivors. The portrait was accurate in its broad lines and wrong in most of its specifics. It described him as tall, which he was not. It listed his nationality as uncertain, which was perhaps fair. It estimated his age at 60, which would have given him a grim satisfaction. The warrant for his arrest, issued in early 1695 and distributed to every colonial governor and naval captain in the Atlantic theater, described him as extremely dangerous, highly capable in seamanship and navigation, possessed of a crew of similar character, and to be apprehended with maximum available force. This warrant found him eventually in the way that things eventually find men who have been at sea too long and trusted too few people, through the exhaustion of luck and the accumulated weight of enemies. In the spring of 1696, the Patience put into a harbour on the island of São Nicolau in the Cape Verde archipelago to take on water. The harbour was small, Portuguese, and theoretically neutral. Hooft recommended against it. Vane overruled him, citing the state of the water casks and the crew's condition after a difficult Atlantic crossing. This decision, the first in Hooft's memory that Vane had made against his own navigator's recommendation, was later understood as the moment when the calculations that had governed Vane's survival finally went wrong. 2 days after the Patience anchored in the harbour, a Portuguese naval frigate arrived on a routine resupply mission and recognized the sloop from a wanted circular that the frigate's captain had received 3 months earlier in Lisbon. The frigate was larger, better armed, and had the harbour mouth. The confrontation that followed lasted 40 minutes and generated a noise that was heard by every person on the island. Vane fought in the way he always fought, with precision, from close range, making use of the Patience's maneuverability against the frigate's weight. But the harbour was too small and the frigate too close, and after the Patience took a chain shot through her mainmast in the 21st minute, the mathematics shifted in a direction that could not be argued with. Hooft was wounded in the exchange. 4 of the crew were killed. The Patience, her mainmast down and her foredeck on fire, was run aground on the harbour's sandy shallows by Vane himself, who apparently chose grounding over sinking with a preference for the options that did not end his crew in open water. He was taken at the water's edge, wading in the shallows, with the fire of his own ship reflecting off the sea around him. The Portuguese sailors who arrested him reported that he offered no resistance. He was bound, brought aboard the frigate, and confined to a locked cabin below the waterline. He was alive. This was noted as mildly surprising. The subsequent proceedings were not fast. Vane was transported to Lisbon in the custody of the Portuguese Navy, where his case immediately became a diplomatic complication. England wanted him tried in a British court under the Acts Against Piracy. Portugal had legitimate claim of capture, and the Spanish, through their ambassador, submitted a formal demand for extradition related to the silver transport of 1690. The legal negotiations occupied nearly a year. During this time, Vane was held in a fortress outside Lisbon, with the particular luxury afforded to prisoners whose continued living existence remained diplomatically useful. He was given paper and a pen. He used them intermittently to write what his jailers described as notes and calculations, navigation problems by the look of them. Though some pages appeared to contain words rather than numbers, these documents were confiscated upon his transfer to English custody in late 1697 and never formally catalogued. He was tried at the High Court of Admiralty in London in the spring of 1698, under the same acts that would govern the more famous pirate trials of the following decades. The proceedings were efficient. The documented evidence was extensive, the surviving witnesses were credible, and Vane's own conduct throughout, quiet, attentive, answering questions with the minimal accuracy of a man who has decided that the outcome is already determined, offered nothing that might have complicated the verdict. The verdict was death. He was hanged at Wapping in May 1698 in the manner prescribed for pirates, which included suspension from a gibbet above the Thames at low tide, and left there until 3 tides had washed over him. This was the law's way of making a point about the sea, that its creatures, taken from it, belonged to it still, and that justice required the water to acknowledge its own. Hooft, who had recovered from his wound and been released on a lesser charge after testifying extensively about Vane's operations, was in London that month on other business. Whether he witnessed the execution is not known. He returned to sea within a year, working as a navigation pilot for a merchant house out of Amsterdam, and died in his bed in Rotterdam in 1721 at the age of 71. Which was considered a remarkable age for a man who had spent his life on the water. Grieve, transported and then pardoned, settled eventually in Bristol and became a tide waiter, a customs official who boarded incoming ships to assess cargo, a position whose irony was not lost on him and which he held for the rest of his life without particular distinction. The Patience herself, run aground in the harbour at São Nicolau, was pulled off the shallows by the Portuguese and found to be too damaged for repair. She was stripped of her iron fittings, her remaining cannon, her blocks and rigging, and then left to fall apart in the harbour shallows where she had grounded, her planks going grey and soft, and then dissolving into the sand over the following years, until nothing was visible at low tide except a scatter of iron bolts and a section of keel timber, dark and rigid as bone. In the carpenter's chest, recovered from the Patience before she was stripped, the Portuguese salvage crew found, among the tools and spare parts, a folded piece of oilskin wrapped around a single navigational chart. The chart showed the Atlantic from the Canaries to the Caribbean, with the principal shipping lanes marked in faded ink and a set of notations in a hand that the salvage captain did not recognize. The chart was brought to Lisbon and filed in the Naval Archive, where it remained for many years in a folder with a label that read only "Documents recovered, unknown vessel, Cape Verde Islands, 1696. Someone had marked in the margin of the chart, in different ink and at a different time from the navigational notations, a single line in English. The archivists who eventually catalogued the folder translated it without particular interest and moved on. It read, "The sea does not forget what the land prefers not to remember.